This is going to be a short presentation on Chapter 2, Food Evaluation, and we are going to be focusing on the sensory tests. So here you see the different types of tests that are used to evaluate food. The two main groups or types of food evaluation are sensory tests and objective tests. So just like they say, sensory tests are using our senses to detect differences or individual preferences between different products or samples, whereas objective tests are going to be done in a laboratory setting using more objective measures such as lab equipment that don't allow for human interference. So I want to focus on our sensory tests since that's what our lab is going to be based on. The two main types of sensory tests are analytical or affective sensory tests. So the difference between these two is that the analytical tests help us to detect differences between a few samples or products, whereas the affective tests help us to detect individual preferences. So affective tests, also known as acceptance or preference tests, help us to determine how preferred or how much pleasure we have from a specific food product. So I like to think of this as affective. How does it change your affect? Does it make you happy, or do you absolutely hate it? Does it make you sad? Whereas our analytical tests, we are trying to find specific differences between the tests, but still using our human senses to do that. So with our analytical tests, we can further break that down into discriminative or descriptive tests. Both of these are going to be done typically by a trained panel who are able to determine the differences between samples. So the main question for discriminative tests is to answer, are the samples different? Whereas with descriptive tests, the main purpose is to answer or how different are the samples. So again, this takes a trained eye or trained palate to be able to determine if samples are different and how those samples are different. Our affective or acceptance preference tests can be done by a consumer panel. We can break the acceptance or preference test down into two groups, our hedonic tests and our personal preference tests. A hedonic test is going to use some type of hedonic scale. That might be a 0 to 10 rating pleasure or a smiley face to a sad face. So if you think of a pain scale at a hospital, that's a hedonic scale. Hedonic tests are used to answer the question, how much do you like the sample? Whereas personal preference tests are used to determine which sample that consumer may prefer. So as you can see, these are useful in their own right for especially our affective tests to determine consumer preference or how much a consumer may like a proposed product. So I want to look further into our discriminative tests, which, remember, discriminative tests were under the analytical or effective tests under sensory tests. So our discriminative tests are again done by typically a trained panel, but y'all in lab are going to practice these discriminative tests with each other. So there are three types. There's more than three types of discriminative tests, but we are going to practice these three, so I wanted to be sure to cover this. We have our triangle test, our duo-trio test, and a paired comparison test. The triangle test answers which is different. So an individual on that trained panel will be given 3 samples. They'll all look identical, but 2 of those 3 samples are the same, and 1 of the 3 samples is different. The panel individual's job is to determine which of those samples is different. And that is the triangle test. In a duo-trio test, they are trying to have the trained panel member determine which sample is most similar to the standard. So the panel person will have 3 samples in front of them. However, one will be marked as the standard. So they'll have the standard and then 2 samples, again, that look identical, but their job is to match the like sample with the standard. That is our duo trio test. And finally, with the paired comparison test, the trained panel person is asked to identify which sample has the most of whatever quality is trying to be understood. So one might be which sample is most sweet. So they might have two samples that aren't identical but may be similar, and that trained panel person is charged with determining which of these samples is sweetest. So here we look at the comparison and contrast of sensory and objective evaluations. So with sensory evaluations, these can be expensive because you're having to train panel members, recruit people to come and participate in a sensory evaluation. They may be compensated for some way, and it could be expensive because you might have to redo tests. If maybe you change a product, you might want to do another test to see if it will be well accepted. However, these sensory evaluations are very important to research and development. So a company may create a product and take it to a consumer panel or a trained panel even, and find that aspects of the product aren't preferred, and so they might have to go back to the drawing board and make some modifications to that product. So research and develop largely depends on the sensory evaluation. Objective evaluation, on the other hand, because it utilizes scientific method and laboratory equipment, those outcomes are going to be a lot more reliable and repeatable. So the outcomes of these objective evaluations are going to be pretty set in stone and solid. So what you're looking at with objective evaluations can be helpful for quality control because they may help to determine risk of like foodborne illness, or if there's things in that product that shouldn't be there, and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, the sensory evaluation and objective evaluation both play a role in evaluating food to get the safe and well-preferred products to the consumer. So that was this week's lecture short. If you have any questions, please post to the Muddy Points forum, and I, myself, or your classmates can help to answer your questions.